So of late we've been doing things like working with the base chakra and attachments of the base chakra. So today's meditation is going back to the base chakra and the understanding that human consciousness is connected at the base chakra because we are incarnated. So when we choose to become incarnated, that's what holds our identity here. And the 4 petals of the base chakra are often used symbolically of the 4 archetypes that are the basic foundations of human consciousness. Carl Jung said that unconsciously, subconsciously, and consciously, all human beings subscribe to those 4 archetypes of the prostitute, the saboteur, the inner child, and the victim. Now, we all subscribe to those belief patterns, conditioning, experiences, everything to do with those 4 archetypes, and we understand them colloquially. But for today's meditation, we want to focus on just the inner child that has been coming up over and over and over again. And in the new moon, we want an opportunity to rebirth that inner child into a whole new understanding of being present on the planet and present as part of a larger consciousness than just self as consciousness. An important part of meditation is that we use it as a way to develop self, to acknowledge self, to understand self, to be quiet with self, and to get to know ourselves better, to engage in an inner dialogue. And part of that inner dialogue is to get to know the inner self as it is never demonstrated for people outside of us. Psychology tells us that we are always this inner child, and that there are different types. In fact, Carl Jung identified different types of inner child. There's the eternal child. Peter Pan is the eternal child. Somebody who never quite grows up, always maintains the innocence of a child, the ability to remain childish, somewhat in the shadow side of things, always immature, somewhat a brat, never quite maturing into the ability to maintain adult responsibilities. One might even say that the eternal child maintains a childlike innocence and emotional immaturity in the world. Then we have the divine child. The divine child is one who feels connected to the divine, connected spiritually to the divine in its light aspect, and therefore has a deep and abiding faith almost from the moment of being born, all the way through to the shadow side, where the conditioned or religious conditioning of a child turns that child into a hardcore fanatic or zealot, and the divine child then becomes its shadow aspect, where it uses religion as its reason for being destructive or its motive for being destructive in the world. And all of that means that that childhood conditioning is never questioned, is never outgrown, is never matures into a critical assessment or evaluation of the world. Then we have the child wounded. The child wounded is the most common amongst the most common of the two of the most common. Okay. It's one of the 2 most common inner child archetypes that we have. The wounded child is the child who is holding trauma from childhood, an experience of trauma that results in an agreement, a self-limiting agreement that keeps one stuck in that trauma all the way through adulthood, and again into an inability to maintain or manage self as an adult. Different types of trauma, different types of abuse. Sometimes it can be something little that seems so overwhelming to a child's mind that it stunts one's emotional and mental development. Okay. And then we have the child orphaned or abandoned. Now this particular child comes up all the time, essentially as a primary archetype for almost every human being on the planet, because we experience our separation from God. Even the divine child experiences this feeling of being separate from God or separate from the rest of the universe by virtue of taking incarnation, becoming part of a physical body that gives us the impression of being separate from everything else. The child abandoned or orphaned very often experiences actual neglect, actual abandonment, or being orphaned at an early age or at a stage in its development where the feeling of being alone, separate, unsupported, unheard in the universe is entrenched, and the agreement that that child's consciousness creates is that I am not connected to anything. It is one of the most common forms of inner child as in human consciousness as we experience it now. And then we have the child natural, the child who is at one with creation, who is at one with animals and plants and has a green thumb and is so much part of creation that they are at their happiest in the natural world. They intuitively work with the natural world, are healed by it, are so connected to it that they cannot see themselves as separate from it. The shadow side of that is that the child natural, for example, Tarzan is an example of that archetype. But the shadow side of that is that the child natural goes into a destructive mode around nature itself. Deep fears around nature, about the overwhelming power of nature, and is in constant resistance to it. Now, when I describe these archetypes, it's very nice to be able to say, well, there are the different types of inner child, and that we are one of those types. In my experience, however, I find that most people are a combination of those different types of inner child that come together to create an understanding of oneself as a child. And then even that understanding can be covered over or barricaded, have nice sort of facades over it, in terms of people then remembering fabulous childhoods. They'll tell you all about how they've had the most amazing childhood possible, how their parents were fabulous, and how everything was provided, and they were so loved, and they were so taken care of, and every little thing was done for them. And then you have to pull that scab off and go under that to see where a child felt unseen, unheard, neglected, or even consciously abused. Now, I remember from my own work, in my spiritual development, what is going on? Yeah, just lift it up. Thanks. Okay. I feel like I'm going blind. Okay. Oh no. So I remember when I was doing my work, working with these archetypes and wanting to heal that inner child, not only did I find that there were a combination of different types of child coming through, but that very often the one would come through and I would need to outgrow some aspect of that in order to shift into an understanding of another. So they overlap each other, they flow into each other. So I could find the child divine, and I could find the child magical. Oh, this is the other one. The child magical. This is the child who is born with the capacity for alchemy, this capacity to attract people, charisma, the ability to even create magic, to work with the illusion of the world from an understanding that it isn't real and can rise above it. In its shadow side, it is a child who is born cynical, unable to view the world with any kind of real joy, and has a deep deep distrust of the world in general. So one doesn't ever imagine that a child will be born like that. We think that children have to be conditioned into having, through experiences, into learning to mistrust. But because we bring information from other lifetimes into this lifetime, we can actually be born into those shadow archetypes as children, and then we have, from that, we manifest the experiences of making those things real, so we can pinpoint a moment in this physical life that explains why that type of child becomes our inner child. So in my work, I discovered that things overlap, and that even as you heal the one, it will flow into the healing of the other, and then flow back to where you started, and there'll be something else that comes together. So in my understanding and experience, I prefer to say, okay, we're all an inner child. We have this archetype. We are enacting this archetype. And whichever type we are, we must understand that there is one dominant inner child archetype, but that it has the influences of the other types. Because all of us as children have had interaction with animals or nature. We've all been to the beach or to the mountains or played in our gardens. We've all had some kind of moment in which we have felt neglect or unheard or unseen. And from adult hindsight, we can't tell which experience speaks louder to the choices we're making now, or which experience has created an agreement inside that limits us and drives the saboteur archetype. So I prefer to give them all equal breathing room inside, if you will, and pay attention to what the behavior is when something feels limited or doubtful. So when I look at how the inner child works with the other archetypes, for example, the saboteur, this inner child will sit underneath the saboteur, and the inner child who feels worthless or unheard, unable to express itself or to be taken seriously in its expression of itself, then the saboteur will automatically go into, well, maybe I shouldn't do that. What if I do this? It will automatically begin to limit itself from the perspective of preempting from what other people will think, what other people will say. The constant need for other people's approval before I even venture into having the experience or doing something. And of course, the brain of the child is already trained to understand that it will meet with judgment. Now, this is what happens from the inner child's perspective, that our training as children speaks as our own inner voice, loud and clear, sometimes in our own voice, and sometimes in the voices of the adults we've grown up with, in order to inform us and keep us in check as adults. And that's why we work with healing the inner child, healing it and making it more wholesome, bringing it back to a space of innocence within us so that it can meet the world now from an adult perspective, moment by moment. The judgment, the fear, other people's opinions as they already exist inside of us will limit our ability to meet the world as it is in every now moment. It will preempt the experience. It will taint it. It will distort it. And of course, it will drag us back into the past in order to react to it. So the inner child holds great power over our capacity to experience or create joy in our adult lives now. Now, I don't know about everybody else, but I remember playing as a child and having great fun, and then being scolded afterwards for being outside and playing too long, or being outside and playing with the wrong people, or being outside and even playing the wrong games, because I was always playing boy games.
Yeah. Very good.
Okay. Yeah. And I remember being scolded, and in my mind, as a child, I was being scolded because I had fun. All I remember about the games was that I was there having fun, and now I was being scolded because I was having fun. And very gradually, as I grew up and became a teenager, etc., and then later when I started dating, I would still get scolded for having fun. Different kind of fun, different kind of games being played, different people. But there was a consistency about being scolded because I was having fun. And as a result, I fully expected, as I grew, that fun would come at a price. Fun would come with some kind of understanding from somebody else over there that I had broken some rule. And I never knew what the rules were, but guaranteed my having fun was going to break them. If I had fun, somebody somewhere was going to make me feel guilty about it. And thankfully, I also have a rebel archetype which said, oh, well, the hell with that. And it would have fun anyway. But for a lot of children who don't have the rebel archetype, it is deeply entrenched at the very beginning that if they have too much fun, or if they have fun at all, they are going to suffer later. And so the willingness to be relaxed, to have fun, to enjoy life as an adult is closed up from the understanding that any fun you have is going to result in a punishment, is going to result in pain. So avoid having fun and you'll avoid the pain, which doesn't work actually, because then you're just perpetually in pain. So I find this brain loses it. It just loses it when it comes to making conscious choices. It leaps to the most ridiculous conclusions as if it is a child's brain and doesn't have the awareness that I am now an adult who can moderate my fun and manage the punishment, or ensure, because I have authority over myself, that there is no punishment at all. But we fully expect that there will be punishment later in terms of judgment and other people's opinions. I also remember as a child teaching other children. I mean, I was a teacher archetype from the very beginning. And teaching other children, getting their homework done all the way through high school, and eventually feeling overwhelmed by the responsibility. Because suddenly, it was if you didn't teach it properly, those people, if they didn't get it right, it was your fault. And I mean, as teachers, you must feel that responsibility. So I got the understanding that if you teach something to somebody, make sure they get it right. Make sure they do it properly. If they don't do it properly, it's your fault. It's your responsibility. You wasted their time when you were teaching them. It's taken me a lot of years in this center to get to a point where I can say, I can teach till I'm blue in the face, and if everybody doesn't understand, well, it's not my problem. It's okay. I'm just teaching. Whether you're learning, which is the other side of my teaching, is up to you. But when we are children, and of course when you are teachers in the real world out there, that doesn't apply. Because the performance of your students becomes your responsibility. And that connectedness between an action here and a result there that is beyond your control is exactly what the powerlessness of every one of the inner child archetypes is. Because as children, we are essentially powerless. Love does not give us power as children. Being loved does not give us power as children. As children, we are subject to other people's authority and choices and decisions for our lives, right down to what you're going to eat, what time you should go to bed, who should be your friends and who shouldn't be your friends. Almost every decision is made by an adult who has forgotten how it is to be a child. And so the one thing that every one of those inner child archetypes has in common is an understanding of its powerlessness. It's subject to a higher authority, or any authority that is presumed to be higher than authority of self. And there are very few children who are raised to be self-managing. I was given a house key at age 5. I had to be self-managing. I had to make sure I never lost my house key. And I don't know whether that was good for me or bad for me, but it gave me independence and self-sufficiency at a very early age. And then, of course, I had two older sisters breathing down my neck at the same time, making sure that I didn't lose those keys. You know, making sure that I stayed on track. So I used to eat their lunch. I used to do that. I used to eat all their food. Yeah. It was great fun. So there's some things that we did as children that we shouldn't have done, which is great fun. But I mean, when you think about this, and you think about all of the moments that live as highlights inside of you, then what kind of inner child are we looking at? I mean, which are the moments that speak the loudest? Which are the moments that have grabbed you and are alive inside of you? And that speaks to what is the most dominant inner child that you are living with. I mean, just take a moment to look for yourself. What is, when you think about this childhood, what glares out at you? And if I look at the pattern, I mean, if you look at a pattern of those memories, what is the pattern in terms of the emotion? What is the pattern in terms of the feelings that connect those memories? Because I have tons of good memories. But the things that sit there as like, oh my God, I remember that and I remember that and I remember that, was always having somebody decide for me. Like my mother deciding my hair was too much of a nuisance. Long hair was too much of a nuisance. And one afternoon she just put it into a ponytail and cut off the ponytail. It's like, oh my God. Hugely traumatic. And I had this like huge bouffant of hair around my head. I looked awful. And then she put these like dumbbell ponytails, which was so humiliating. Now it's funny. But then it was just awful. And of course, from then on, I hated my hair until I went bald for 2 years. I hated my hair. It was always a nuisance. It was always a problem. It was a pain in the ass. Now I love it most of the time. Now I have a system, you know. Now I give it attention, consciously give it attention. And when I look at this, I can see that pattern. I can see why all of these feelings would have been there. Why it was so difficult to get to grips with the nature of this unruly, rebellious hair that was exactly like me. So all this inner child work has been wonderful for me. And I must say, living with Paddy made it a whole lot easier because she could be very childlike. Animals are like that. They can be very childlike and completely open in their approach to life. So living with Paddy, even when she decided to be a big mother hen and nag, still made reaching into that childhood a whole lot easier. And when we live with children, I mean, they also give us a new way of looking at ourselves as children. And our interactions with them give us an opportunity to be children again. Of course, when they're growing children, teenagers, life gets very difficult, and we forget that we were children once or teenagers once. So this meditation hopefully will remind us all that there were days when we were in nappies too. Does anybody remember being in nappies?
Vaguely.
What, were you wearing nappies until you were 5? Then?
I can remember stuff from when I was 2.
That's a long way back to go, Maris.
Feeding the ducks in the park.
Does anybody else go far back? Like 2 years? The average human brain goes back to about age 8. And then, of course, anything earlier than that, it has stories that have been told or photographs that it's been told to then stimulate those memories. But it's very rare that the human brain will automatically go as far back as, say, age 2. In fact, most people above average would go as far back as age 4 or 5.
I remember being 4 because that was when I started school. And it was the year my grandmother died. I can remember that.
You know, that's like a highlight moment. Okay. How about you lot on internet? Anybody go all the way back to age 2? 3?
No.
No. 10? it's sometimes difficult to know which are actual memories and which are stories that have now created memories, or photographs that have now created memories, or what are you really feeling in terms of your cellular memory, or what is your brain just telling you because you've heard it, or these stories have been told so many times by other people that they're now part of your memory system, but what you're remembering are the stories rather than the actual experience. So for me, when I started doing this inner child work with my guides, they would sit me down quietly, and there'd be a sensation of actually downloading memories, because everything we have ever experienced is recorded in the mass consciousness, in the Akashic records, which is why Carl Jung made sense. He said we all work in this massive unconsciousness, and we work along exactly the same archetypes. We're feeding into it all the time. We're receiving from it all the time. The ocean of consciousness to which we all belong as a common entity is now psychologically set with those 4 archetypes. But with our experiences, we are recording our individual history into each of those archetypes. So I was taught how to sit quietly and download the memories so that I could feel them in my body and heal them in my body. Took a while. Took a long while. But it was worth doing, and I wonder if we can do that in meditation with practice. But not today. Not today. Today we're just going to work with what kind of inner child am I, and how do they overlap, and where do I need... Okay, now this is getting too weird for me. I can't hear myself talk anymore. You know that feeling when your ears are blocked after you've been at an altitude? Yeah. It's like I'm echoing somewhere there, but I can't hear myself.
It's like water in your ears sort of comes back at you.
Yeah, weird. First I was going blind, now I can't hear. Anything else? No, I didn't say that. I didn't say that. I didn't say that. Yeah, I'll lose my voice next. This should be fabulous. Okay. So today's meditation, we want to focus in on the different types of inner child that you are working from. And it's new moon, so it's a great time to release or to surrender or to heal anything that is sitting there as a specific wound or sore or even agreement that is limiting you as an adult.